Hey everyone! Thank you so much for watching another episode of the Weaviate Podcast. We have a super exciting one today with two of the world's leaders in the business strategies underlying generative AI and software, cloud computing. I'm super grateful to be hosting them both on the Weaviate Podcast. Firstly, I'm super excited to welcome back Weaviate co-founder Bob Van Light. Bob, thank you so much for joining.
No, thanks again for having me, Connor. It's always great to be back on the podcast. We're getting close to 100, or am I wrong here?
Yeah. I think this will be, well, we'll see how we publish it, but yeah, definitely excited to hit 100. And I'm super excited to welcome Dai Vu, Managing Director of Google Cloud Marketplace and independent software vendor go-to-market. Dai, thank you so much for joining our podcast.
Yeah, thanks, Bob. Thanks, Connor. Great to be here with you.
Yeah, this is great. It's great to have you here, Dai. So one thing that I'm like super curious about to learn is like 1.5 years ago, maybe a year ago, we saw like these different models, and we saw the models what was happening, and open source started to happen, and now all the market is changing because what's happening in open source, but also hosted models. I would love to, learn and hear how you think about that, and if it's changing in a way that the market is changing or evolving in a way that you were thinking that it would, or it's like completely different.
Yeah. I mean, honestly, I think it's evolving the way we thought it would, and it's a little bit consistent with how Google and Google Cloud has embraced open source in general, right? So I think, just taking a step back, I think the way we think about ultimately thinking about customer choice and thinking about open source, thinking about whether we have first party services or third party services in the ecosystem, we leave it up to the customer. And ultimately, us as a platform, we'd rather win the workload than not win the workload. And if that means our first party services or third party or open source, I think that's what we embrace. And I think that's been very consistent with the way we've worked with the ecosystem in general in open source.
Yeah. And so just before going into the models and AI, I'm of course have Weaviate is open source, so I'm a big open source fan. I always like to ask, guests, especially when they look at it from a business perspective, right? So more on a philosophical level. Why does open source work for infrastructure? Why
Yeah.
does that work so well, in your opinion?
Well, I think a couple reasons. I think number one is, from a business model perspective, like you said, which is if we're a platform provider and we want to sort of drive platform adoption and infrastructure and drive the consumption, the economics make sense, whether, again, it's third party or open source. So that works very well. But I think honestly, the other piece with open source is has to do with sort of like the portability in the ecosystem, right? Which is from our perspective, especially coming from a very sort of like third position in the hyperscaler market, but a very fast growing. We have a very intent to sort of drive adoption of our platform. And, part of what we see in terms of like multi-cloud and on-prem is, once you adopt these technologies in other environments and get it portable, you can sort of drive other areas of differentiation of adoption on Google Cloud. So it's almost like, what we saw with GKE and Kubernetes and Anthos, where, a lot of what we were seeing is customers were wanting to sort of modernize their applications, and they do it sort of like in place. And if and when they're ready to move to cloud, there'd be sort of a natural preference to adopt Google Cloud Platform. So I think that's part of the reasons why people are embracing this. But then just generally, us being sort of an open cloud provider, also driving that ecosystem adoption.
Yeah, and so if we um what's so interesting, because if you kind of peel off the onion and you look at like from your perspective as a cloud provider, you always end up with like storage, memory, and compute, right? That is like if you peel off that onion, has that changed with the TPUs and the GPUs entering the scene, or is it conceptually just same thing?
I think conceptually it's the same. I mean, to be clear, when we think about the underlying components of cloud infrastructure like compute storage, I think our goal is to shift the conversation to higher layer services. So yes, underlying the monetization may be in compute storage, but I think ultimately what we want to do is sort of shift the conversation where the atomic unit of consumption of cloud moves from like compute hour or terabytes per month to something a little bit more higher layer services, because I think that creates some of the stickiness and sort of preference for the cloud platform. And that could be either sort of the higher layer services like AI and data, as well as our ecosystem that sort of drives and builds on top of that platform. But fundamentally, I think that's the case, which is even with the GPUs and sort of like infrastructure providers, we're still driving some element of that sort of broad adoption to drive the platform.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and I'm also curious because of course, as a US as one of the biggest, like one of the big three, if I may call it like that, right? Serving customers all over the world. I'm so curious to to hear how you see that from the perspective of machine learning models and AI when it comes to what's important to customers today. So to give a little bit more color to my question is so of course, as a database provider, as vector database provider, we always have the models, they run next to the database, if you will. And one of the things that we've been seeing for a long time, that was the quality of the model. So people were like, we don't care if it's behind like an API, or we don't care if it's an open source model, whatever is best. However, we now we now entered this era, if you will, in AI models, where there's a state of like good enough, if you will.
Yeah.
So regardless of what model you take, it's like you kind of the output is kind of similar, and so changing models not always results in better results. So that means that other considerations for customers, uh, price,
Yeah.
ease of use, security, those kind of things start to play a role. And I'm just curious what you're seeing in the market right now. So it's now April, almost May 2024. So just to give some dates to like the everything is moving so fast. But how are you seeing this evolve, and what do you think the next big important step is going to be for infrastructure providers?
Yeah.
Giving customers access to these models.
Well, I think a couple things. So I think, like you said, I think the open models, I think, will be in terms of capability, will continue to grow quite a bit, and I think to a point where it's going to be very comparable with some of the proprietary models. So I think that's like one evolution that you're going to see quite a bit. But I think and then some of the things that we think about in terms of like, hey, when would you consider using sort of like let's just take a look at this sort of the foundational models. When would you want to use sort of like open source versus sort of the proprietary? A lot of it is, like you said, could be sort of budget constraints. Other could be the ability to do customization and innovation, experimental and learning. But I think there will also be a model where end customers will want to use a combination of different open source as well as different proprietary models as well. I think a lot of platforms are now adopting. Sort of architectures that are sort of leveraging sort of like multiple foundational models. So I think that's going to be one element of the sort of that evolution. But I think the big piece in terms of like what customers are going to want some sort of flexibility is, how do they engage with the model, right? So I mean, a lot of it is, I think there are a lot of different ways we could take this. I'd love to get your thoughts as well, right? Which is, at Google Cloud Next, which you attended, one of the big themes is like last year was a big year of sort of like proof of concepts and experimentation. And then this year is like now people are really scaling into production to like real sort of like specific use cases. And, the ones that, come up most frequently are things like, complementing software development, content creation with marketing, customer service, and so forth. So I think just having the capability and ease of use of our customers to sort of incorporate this into different ways to interact, whether it be incorporating their own corpus of data, fine tuning, all the different ways we can work with the different platforms. So I think there are a lot of different ways we can evolve here.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And to answer your question, so it's something that we see as well, right? So um, uh, the, one of the words that I often use, or what I talk about is like something what I call AI native. And what I mean with AI native, what the difference between a quote unquote traditional application that has model integrations or or embedding integrations versus an AI native application is like, if we would take out the AI element, would the application still work? Right. So and then of course if it sits at the heart of what people are building, that's what we call AI native. And what we started to see was the first thing that people experimented with, which 1.5 years back, 2 years back, was vector search. Hey, we have these embeddings, we can search over them. So it was the first applications were more like it was a feature, right? It was like, hey, we can do a little bit better search or a better recommendation engines. And out of that, people started to say like, hey, actually we can build completely new products and new solutions on top in the combination of the generative models, the embedding models, and the vector database. And then out of that we got like everything we saw with reg, and then out of that we saw stuff with generative feedback loops and so on and so forth. And there's a correlation between what's going into production right now and what people are still experimenting with, because there's just this time element involved. But what's super interesting to see is that that what we like to call AI native, so where people really build end to end with AI, that apparently we've hit this threshold where there's enough trust to do that, to say, okay, we're not going to make this an add-on anymore, we're just going to completely go all in on AI. And then that there's like this logical lag, and because first you need to experiment with it, then you want to do a bigger POC, then you go to production. And what we see right now is that what we see, for example, now with the biggest customers, that is like hybrid search and the first bigger rec applications. And now slowly these newer, even more AI native applications start to go to production. And then indeed, the quality of the models doesn't play a role per se anymore, but more like, oh boy, if you now need to do this with like 100 million data objects, that can be pretty expensive. So we want to have something, that's more affordable, or those kind of things. So that's something we definitely see, and that actually that kind of leads to a next question. This is just purely out of personal interest, but one thing that I believe is that we've always had this question of like, we had like SQL databases, right? And then we got this new wave of very powerful NoSQL databases, right? And we have seen some clear winners, both in open source, proprietary, those kind of things. And one of the questions I always been asking myself is, now with everything that's happening with AI, and where we see a database like Weaviate, where we really try to, well, no pun intended, weave the models and the database more together. Is that just another flavor of NoSQL, or is that something really new that's happening because people are building these new types of applications? And I'm curious how you
Yeah,
see that, also based on your experience.
yeah,
Are you saying like, no, this AI thing is just an add-on, or are you saying no, no, no,
yeah.
a new wave and there's something new happening?
Well, before answering that question, let me go back to your AI native observation. I was curious when you think about the sort of evolution of this concept of AI native and compare it to traditional sort of cloud native, where I think one of the biggest sort of like velocity challenges we saw with sort of cloud native and thinking about like containers and microservices was this concept that you had to sort of re-architect existing applications, whereas greenfield and new applications became a little bit easier. And so, similar concept, which is if you are looking at AI native, are you looking primarily at sort of like new applications and new use cases as opposed to sort of modifying existing platforms?
Um, so yes, and the metaphor that I often use is, and I mean I could also plot it over cloud native, but I actually often use like mobile, right? So uh, um, back in the day, I mean, I don't know, maybe Connor, you're maybe too young for this, but I'm pretty sure that Dai remembers this, and I do. Is that when we got mobile phones, right? So we started to see these websites that you or had like the desktop website, or you had the mobile equivalent of the website. Just two completely different websites, right? And then rather than saying we're gonna adjust one or the other or have two, we got these frameworks and these front end frameworks that became mobile native. So that we said like it's just responsive, right? It doesn't matter if you look at this website on your desktop, on your phone, and later your tablet. It will just always render accordingly. And the products that people started to build all of a sudden changed into becoming like native for whatever device that you were using. And with cloud native, let's take Weaviate as an example, right? So our database is born in the cloud age, right? So that's also why we call Weaviate cloud native. It's so depending on things like Kubernetes and those kind of things, right? And now features that we have in our multi-tenancy setup that you can offload to storage buckets and those kind of things. That is just it's so interwoven and assuming that it will run in the cloud that it's like it's a completely different product that if you would have been building Weaviate 20 years ago before that existed, right? So the point that I want to make is like the way that we build front end applications, the way that we build these cloud applications, that is so interwoven and so unique for the platform that it runs on top of, that I think that we see the same thing with AI. So it's like people assume things that they can do with the models, and then they start building that they just simply could not do before these models
Yeah,
existed.
yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think as we transition, like I said, from the year from like experimentation and POCs to more production use cases, I do think it is a little bit more of adding the experience, especially if you see in things like customer service applications. I do find that they're sort of augmenting sort of like core experience with something that is very unique or enabled via Gen AI and the models. But it isn't something like you said, which is if you take that away, what do you have? And I think you still have a lot of the existing things. So I think this will take a little bit of time, but I see the evolution that you're describing.
Yeah, and I think so. For example, I can actually based on the customer service use cases, right? So an example of a feature might be that you say, "Oh, we're gonna vectorize the customer question. We're gonna do a similarity search on existing questions, and then we're gonna automatically assign labels." Or people who can answer this question based on previous questions, right? Based on searching through vector space and those kind of things. That for me would be a feature. So that's where I say like that's an add-on to something that we have. If you now take this exact same use case, but we make it AI native, is that we say, well, we still gonna vectorize the question of the customer, but actually we're gonna use that to search through existing answers or existing documentation, and with a generative model in hand, we're gonna generate a response for the customer real time. And that is what we internally call generative feedback loops, because you go to the database and the models and then you feedback loop it back into the database. That is something that is what I would call AI native, because now you ask a question and the AI answers the question in the customer service system near real time. And that's the difference between the feature and the AI native, in this case, customer service use case.
Yeah, yeah. No, it makes sense. Makes sense. So yeah, I mean, I think we're definitely headed to that model as people are scaling. But I think this will be a critical like 12 to 18 months as people sort of drive that scaled adoption.
Yeah, and if we just go a little bit more, if we make a little bit more philosophical, if you will, or esoteric, I'm very curious if the cloud itself, of course, has this data gravity is so important for the cloud, right? So where does the data reside, right? In which systems, how systems interact with? Because it's a the gold is still the data, and then we have all the tooling to deal with the data stored and those kind of things. So
Yeah.
this question is about data gravity.
Yeah.
Um, do
Yeah.
you think that that's going to change? So is it like, are the models having an impact on the role of the importance of the data itself? And will that the gravitational force of the raw data move? Will it go in the model? Will it change? Or do you say no, 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 that's unchanged? It's just the models are now just moving towards the data rather than the data towards the models.
So how do you make that distinction? Models moving to the data versus data to the models. Like what
Yeah,
distinction are you making there?
yeah. So for example, let's take the context window as an example, right? So now we see, like, I believe that what is it? Gemini has like what is it? A 1 million token context window, right? So very soon they just gonna probably make that like 10 million, 100 million. So just a
Mhm.
lot, right?
Yeah.
So huge context window. So now a question becomes, right? Well, if, and let's also, for the sake of argument, assume that all the models are very good at distilling information from the context window.
Mhm.
So now if you have the model with the context window, or you have the database with the data, that so what we sometimes see are like people saying like, oh, the large context window killed the vector database because it's just all stored in the context window. By the way, I disagree with that premise. I will in a bit explain why. But
Mhm.
if that's true, then that would mean that data gravity moves towards the model because it just sits in the context window.
Mhm.
My argument is actually the other way around. That I say like, um, definitely the large context window is important, but in the end, all these tokens still need to be converted into vector embeddings. So
Mhm.
what I believe is actually that the vector database becomes the context window of the future.
Yeah.
And then it would mean that data gravity just stays in the database and we just add the model
Yeah.
on the side. So that is what I meant with like, is it moving towards the model, the data, or will it just stay in the vector database and will the model move towards the database?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think there are different ways could evolve, but I do support your theory that this could be the way it evolves, because I think one of the things that maybe you have a concept on this one. What about the emergence of like more capable or smaller language models, or things that are more specific to specific use cases? Because I think data obviously is very beneficial in sort of like the large language models, but I think the problem is these are so general. So could we be looking toward a model where you have smaller models in terms of like parameter counts, and then you sort of like augment that with sort of like your own sort of like corpus of data that are more specific to how you want to sort of apply that model? I mean, that could be another way we could be evolving as well.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think so. What I find interesting with sizes,
Mm-hmm.
regardless if we're talking about um, uh, size in the form of compression or size in the form of an optimal way of storing information in whatever, right? So however we determine size, so just more conceptually size. I think that size in itself is irrelevant because I so one of these predictions that I have, and actually your colleagues at Google are kind of leading the way with, like, I believe it's called the Nano model. Is like, I would not be surprised. So if I use an Android phone, I'll make my point about size, but I need to take a little detour. But if I use my Android phone and I would say like, okay, I want to use the GPS in my phone, right? I would talk to the API, it would give me the GPS coordinates, and I can do whatever I want.
Mm-hmm.
I would not be surprised that in the not too distant future we would see these models, an API in, for example, the phones, just to talk to a generative model. And then as developer, you don't really care, what kind of model, can be like the Gemini Nano model, and you just don't care because you just like you don't care what type of GPS is actually in the Android phone, as long as it gives you the appropriate coordinates, right?
Mm-hmm.
And or the correct coordinates. And the with that, size plays a role, that it needs to be small enough to fit on the phone. But the moment that it's small enough to fit on the phone, it just doesn't matter anymore.
Mm-hmm.
So size just matters for just that specific use case, with the one exception that maybe the models one day become so small,
Hmm.
and we don't see a path towards that yet, but let's say that they become so small that we can say like, oh, for my next application on my phone, I'm actually going to have 100 models run in harmony and communicate with each other to do something, right? And that is then another change I predict would happen.
Hmm.
But as long we're not there yet, then size for me doesn't really matter, because I mean, if I now use like an open source tool as like Llama to
Hmm.
play around with the models on my, what is it? I'm on an 8 gigabyte an 8 gigabyte laptop right now. Just quickly checked.
Hmm.
It just works. I mean, I can have a lot of Chrome tabs open when I'm using Llama on my 8 gigabyte, but it just works. And
Yeah.
so I don't really care how big the model is anymore, right? It just works.
Well, well. Let me just say I mean, it doesn't necessarily matter, but the thing you're raising is if you're getting comparable quality of results to like these larger counterparts, then I think that's what's driving that acceptance of it just works, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay.
And something that I am very interested in, that was also why I asked the question about like the GPUs and the CPUs, is that what I love about what we see happening now in the open source ecosystem
Hmm.
is that people start to create a lot of software acceleration to run these models on CPUs.
Hmm.
And I would not be surprised that the first big win is not going to sit in the size of the model, but in the speed of CPU inference. So it would be super interesting to see. And of course, you sit at a the side of the table where you can actually, I guess, see that in one way, shape, or form. But that like we're now saying the quality of the models are good enough that we're going to say, hey, actually,
Hmm.
CPU inference is fast enough.
Hmm.
So it's cheaper for us to run a couple of models in parallel
Hmm. Hmm.
on CPUs than one on a big, what is it, A100 model or something.
Yeah.
I would not be surprised if that is something we're going to see, so that it's actually going to be more CPU based than GPU based.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, I'll go back. I mean, honestly, what you're describing is sort of consistent with how we've seen things evolve in business in general, which is a lot of like the sort of like the innovation and disruption happens because you have technologies or things that are just good enough and sort of drives the massive adoption, right? So if I were to, compare one example back, I worked. You mentioned my age. I worked at IBM in the early 2000s. I worked on their uh, their power systems, right? So we did a couple of interesting innovations on power, which was like multi core. Like we first came out with multi core like in 2003 or 2004. And we used to always sort of benchmark the our TPC benchmarks with Intel, and honestly, it was chasing a target that really didn't matter because I think Intel just was good enough, and the part that really mattered was the ISV and sort of platform adoption, and then unfortunately, power became sort of like a very sort of narrow focused, even though from a pure computing power shined on all of the industry standard benchmark, it really didn't matter anymore. So I think that evolution is likely to happen. We've seen that repeat itself multiple times in history.
Actually, that is a super interesting point that you're raising there, because you're making a super interesting point around the benchmarking, right? So the and also what you mentioned about history repeating itself, and I would love to ask for like a prediction from you around this, because and that's about the following.
Yeah.
That is the models right now, right? That we have these benchmarks, right? So where people say, like, okay, how well are the models
Hmm.
performing? And we have the open source players, we have the hyperscalers, we have even we see all kinds of companies now releasing models. It's going very fast. It's getting very crowded on Hugging Face right now. And everybody is competing, because the only way to compete right now is like on these benchmarks. But we're getting to a point that is like now a percentage point here, a percentage point over there. And at some point, the question is going to be like, who cares, right? Because it's like, how far
Hmm.
do we need to keep, competing with these models to get to a certain quality where everybody's happy? Because the way I look at it is like the majority of these models, except like the top ones, right? They're kind of very similar in the out, especially the generative models, kind of similar in what they're doing from a generative perspective.
Hmm.
So now we have the open source players really focusing on the quality of the models, but they at some point need to also evolve into a business.
Yeah.
We have a very interesting player in the form of course, Meta, who is like releasing these models to the
Hmm.
and who might or might not decide to to create a business around this.
Hmm.
And then of course we have the hyperscalers also creating their models.
Yep.
If you plot this on what you've seen in the past
Hmm.
with the role of benchmarks,
Hmm.
what do you think is going to happen with these model benchmarks, and how these companies evolve around that?
Well, I mean, I think you're already alluding to it, which is, in the future, the gap between sort of these open source models, these proprietary models, will be narrowed, right? So I think it will give customers great options, and you can go through some of the things we talked about before around like when would you choose sort of an open source versus proprietary model, but more importantly, it becomes less interesting around like just pure benchmarks and more around what the model is delivering for you in terms of and the question is, how do you sort of differentiate the model? It's mostly around the data. It's either your own corpus of data that you're leveraging, or maybe there could be, we're also driving a little bit on data marketplace. So obviously being able to um, on our marketplace offer third party data that you could subscribe to. It could be financial institutions like Equifax and Dun and Bradstreet. And so a combination of your own corpus of data or data that you might purchase or subscribe through a third party could be the way you sort of differentiate or make something unique from your model, as opposed to just looking at pure benchmarks.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very interesting point, because the um, you now raised the point of like data marketplaces and those kind of things. Just a funny side story about Weaviate, and when I started to work with these embeddings, was
Mm-hmm.
that one of the things that I was fascinated with was I was like a big fan of like semantic web and those kind of things.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I was fascinated with was like, why is it so hard for us to agree on data standards?
Mm-hmm.
Right. So you mentioned, for example, let's say financial institutions, or even the weather, right? Why is it so hard on how to agree to call things and make it easy to connect things together? Because now, even if somebody gets something from a data marketplace, then still they need to connect the dots with their internal systems, right? And they need to, need to make sure that everything's aligned, that they mean the same thing. And one of the early ideas with Weaviate was actually, what if we could help and solve that problem? Because back then, in what is it, in 2 months, the business is going to be 5 years old already. So 5 years ago,
Yeah.
we when we were just working with these embeddings, but I always like to say when we called AI still ML,
Yeah.
the idea was like, hey, can we actually have these, if you ship data from a data marketplace with an embedding
Yeah.
that always comes from a generic model, then it becomes significantly easier to
Yeah.
connect data sources together, because like, well, it's not the same thing, but it's like very similar. So therefore we assume it's the same. And so I think my question about that is the data marketplace, I mean, they of course they exist and people use them, and people sell and buy, but and maybe I'm wrong, maybe you have a completely different view, but as far as I see it, they never like really took off, right? So that people are really just
Mm-hmm.
really creating businesses for the sake of just having their data on a marketplace.
Yeah.
And do you think that AI might play a role in breaking that open, to saying
Yeah.
like, hey, finally it became easy enough to
Mhm.
correlate different data sets together, that this whole new ecosystem of data marketplaces starts to emerge?
Yeah. I think it is. It's kind of interesting. You're right. So when I think about data marketplaces, I think there are probably two broad buckets. One is companies that actually their business model is to basically monetize unique data that they have. The other pieces are maybe opportunistically they have some data sets that they potentially want to sort of monetize on the side. And you're right. I think if we look at historically, AWS data marketplace, Snowflake data marketplace, those things they've had some moderate success, but I do think the convergence of AI and data potentially could jumpstart this potentially, right? Because I think it's a combination of who's going to want to data services enhanced by AI, and then AI who wants to sort of like supplement it with like third party data services to sort of differentiate their models. I think a combination of those things potentially could jumpstart it. Now the only thing is there a third bucket of people who would normally wouldn't even think about monetizing data start to provide data services. I mean, there's also sort of like open, free and public data sets as well that are available, right? And that's obviously from a platform provider. I care about that too because I can, potentially have customers use that and then we monetize on the infrastructure. Could there be a proliferation of either open source or third party sort of commercial data sets that are available and sort of driven by this AI growth in the market? So I think it does. I think it's going to jumpstart it. And the question is whether it's going to sort of like 10x it. I don't know. I don't know.
Yeah,
But
yeah, yeah.
I definitely do think it's going to drive some increase in demand.
Oh, that's super interesting. It's like a more because you mentioned the data marketplace, and I was like, oh boy, this is like a this might open up a new thing. So what is the? I have like one last question, and that I'm like super curious about. Like, what? So the of course we had like all the ML came back like around 2015
Yep.
back on the scene, and then we saw like the Transformers being released and Bird and those kind of things.
Mhm.
What was for you the big aha moment that you were like, yes, this will be the next, this is the next, AI is the next big thing?
Yeah.
When was that for you? Well, what did you see? What use case did you saw? What demo did, whatever was
Yeah.
it that you saw that you were like, oh boy, this thing is going to be big?
Well, honestly, it's kind of interesting. I've actually been around AI for over 30 years. Um, so you could actually look this up. When I was an intern at a company called Pitney Bowes in Stamford, Connecticut, back in 1993, I, along with some researchers, published a paper. We call it at the time artificial neural networks, but it was basically applying, these concepts to a very sort of business application, which was sort of understanding, like if we were to send out marketing mailers, what type of hit rate we would get within customers. So I've always seen sort of like the promise of AI, and I've always seen it in a number of different areas. But as you saw, how even Google Cloud has embraced AI. I think the big opportunity for us is when we could apply it to very specific industry solutions. So, AI is a general platform, somewhat interesting, but it's not clear how much people adopt or sort of how you monetize that. But only when we started seeing very specific application use cases. So the classic one was Cloud Customer AI, CCAI, which was a very sort of call center specific industry solution that started to take off in like 2016 and 2017. Those examples, and same thing with like document AI, where you can apply specific industry use cases where I saw the real application. And then obviously when we came out with sort of like the prompt model with Gen AI and seeing multimodal and all of this sort of like broad adoption, it started to take off. But I would say when you could start to see specific industry applications and sort of leveraging sort of like cloud scale infrastructure to drive both the training and inference was where I saw the potential for this. But I've always seen it, like I mentioned, for like 30 years or so.
Yeah, that's so interesting because it's a I remember that I was at Google I/O in 2016,
Mm,
And I still remember, and I fact checked this recently, but I remembered it correctly that Sander was on stage and said like we're gonna move from mobile first to AI first.
that's right.
So
That's right.
that's 8 years ago, right? So it's like it does take. I mean, you mentioned 30 years, but then still, so
Yeah,
it's
yeah,
like it takes some time really to really take off. But it's exciting to see how that's happening right now. So that's a and you know, and I think, well, thank you for sharing
yeah, yeah, yeah.
these thoughts here on the podcast. And it is super exciting for us to also to partner with Google Cloud, because it's as I mentioned, we're cloud native database, so
Mhm.
no cloud, no Weaviate.
Yeah.
So it's just that's just how it is. So it's a and that is fantastic, and I look very much forward to see how also what you guys are working on, how that evolves over time, and all the cool integrations, use cases, and what have you do that we can help and support together. So
Yeah.
thank you for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me. And, obviously, a lot of I sit in the ecosystem organization. So, obviously, we're working with our customers and, working with our partners to sort of incorporate Gen AI, working with customers, scaling adoption, customer go live. So, all the ecosystem is really going to enable us to sort of win in this market. So, really
Hmm.
great opportunity to work with you and continue to sort of scale our business together.
Thank you so much.